Good evening, everyone. I think we're starting. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our session, The Art of the Wellbeing Economy, a dialogue with Professor Tim Jackson. My name's Caroline White, and I'm one of the core members of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Hub for Ireland. And I have a background in ecological economics, and I do research and advocacy for FASTA, which is the Foundation for the Economics of Sustainability. And we're members of the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, or we are. And I'll just very quickly explain what that is in case there are new people who aren't aware of it, and then we move on. The Wellbeing Economy Alliance is a global collaboration of organisations, alliances, movements and individuals who are working together to change the economic system to create a wellbeing economy that can deliver human and ecological well-being. And we all have identified 5 universal human needs, and they can be summed up in a very simple way as dignity, fairness, participation, nature and purpose. And so the challenge, of course, is to find ways that we can meet all those needs and yet not breach planetary boundaries like the climate and biodiversity health. And in practice, in wealthy parts of the world, like Ireland, relatively wealthy parts of the world, of course, that means that we have to find ways to reorient our economy away from the goal of endless expansion of production and consumption and towards a more balanced kind of economy, which can take both the environment and the needs of future generations into account as well. So we all has hubs in 13 countries, as well as Ireland, all around the world, including several other European countries, and also Brazil, India, East Africa, California, and more places joining in. And the We All Ireland Hub was started in 2021 by a group of organisations and individuals, including FASTA, and also the European Health Futures Forum, Social Justice Ireland, Queen's University School of Law in Belfast, the Derry Playhouse, and Cultivate, the Sustainable Ireland Co-op. And we have people from all of those organisations here tonight. So we're an all-Ireland hub, and we have members in both the north and the south. And since our hub got started a year and a half ago, lots of things have happened. For example, on the European level, we're seeing more and more support for wellbeing economy kinds of thinking, including there's the legally agreed 8th Environmental Action Plan, which is a common agenda for environmental policy in the EU till 2030. And it includes the wellbeing economy as part of its mandate. And there's a big conference happening in May of this year in the EU called Beyond Growth, which the European Parliament is hosts. All kinds of grants on the EU level now being given for research into topics like the post-growth European deal and improved measurement of well-being. And in the UK, as well as growing interest and support for the wellbeing economy, for example, just to give a couple of examples, Way approach, which has a very strong emphasis on the needs of future generations. It's led to a whole new and very different policy on road construction. And I just heard today that in Scotland, they've just appointed a new cabinet secretary for the wellbeing economy, fair work and energy. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. Our Ireland Hub has a very wide focus, and some of our work is directly on policy, like engaging with the officials in the Republic on ways in which their new wellbeing framework might be improved. But the wellbeing economy isn't just a technocratic policy matter. And the big questions are really things like what's the economy actually for, and who gets to know about how the economy works, and who should participate in the big decisions about the economy. And these are just vital parts of the whole thing. And it all ties in with the role of storytelling, the stories that all of us tell ourselves about the economy. And that's the focus of a project of ours that we've started with the much appreciated support of the Carnegie UK Trust. And that's the context for tonight's discussion. So in a second, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Peter Doran from the Queen's University Belfast School of Law, and he'll tell you a bit more about it. And just before I stop, I'm going to paste links to some more info about the hub and to our newsletter in the chat. And we'd also love for you to introduce yourselves in the chat if you haven't done so already, and make comments and suggestions all the way through this event. Thanks very much, and on to Peter.
Thank you very much, Caroline. This is Peter Doran at the School of Law at Queen's University, and we're one of the founding partners of the hub. The hub is one thing, and our first project, our first focus will be to convene a community of practice for artists and creatives. So our webinar is the first installment in a deep dive process that's going to take place over the next few days at the Playhouse in Derry to launch that community of practice. And the practice will be the art of the well-being economy. In other words, we are bringing together a community of activists and artists who will consider how they might reflect the values of the well-being economy, as outlined just now by Caroline, how those values might be reflected in their artistic endeavors. We all says at present the current economy is seen as the only kind of economy that we can have. So we need an imagination we need our imagination to think outside of the current models. We need new stories about what is possible. And by changing the narrative, we can make a well-being economy part of our common sense. From the moment that the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Hub on the island of Ireland convened, we are an island of stories and storytelling. So some of us immediately turned to the thought that our artists and writers, creators, should be the first port of call for this work of challenging the closure of our imaginative capacity to challenge and begin to prefigure new ways of being in the world. We were aware in particular of the importance of language and narrative and its relationship to power on this island of all. This relationship is explored by many of our celebrated writers in both Irish and English. And the relationship between power and language, of course, is part of our history of colonialism on the island. For us, the well-being policy conversation must become an invitation to think and be otherwise, to bring something new into the world. And it's for this reason that well-being and transition discourses share something profoundly in common with the work of art and cultural creativity. So the community of practice will provide a home and a platform to support new collaborative work, bringing visibility and transparency to the ways in which the dominant narrative or social imaginary works to colonize or close down our subjectivity, our imagination, our attention, and our time, and bring new imagination, new visibility, and excitement to the emerging worlds of alternative approaches to provisioning, sharing, commenting, and flourishing together. These are the new social imaginaries rising in every corner of the world. So I'm delighted to begin this evening with a welcome for our keynote speaker. Professor Tim Jackson is the director of the Center for Understanding Sustainable Prosperity. He's the author of Prosperity Without Growth, Material Concerns, and his latest book is Post-Growth, Life After Capitalism. And he's worked closely with the UN and the European Commission, as well as with the UK government. And today, Tim is with us in an additional capacity as an award-winning playwright with numerous radio writing credits for the BBC, including love stories, biographies, and thrillers. In his radio work, Tim has used his writing to bring complex scientific ideas to a wider audience, exploring altruism and the conflict between environment and development, for example. So Tim, in many ways, embodies this convergence of ideas around the well-being economy, about new articulations of prosperity, and bringing his artistic and creative faculties to bear in communicating those ideas. So Tim, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Peter. When the moon rises, said the Spanish poet Federico Garcia Lorca, the sea covers the land and the heart feels like an island in the infinite. Children understand this feeling. Look, look, it's the moon, they cry, the moon. They turn their own moon faces up towards you, delight and trepidation finely balanced there. Look at the moon, Daddy. Who are these children, you ask yourself? Where do they come from? The truth is they're strangers visiting us from another country. It's called the future. Your children are not your children, said Khalil Gibran. You may house their bodies, but not their souls, for their souls dwell in the house of tomorrow, which you cannot visit, not even in your dreams. A few years ago, I was installing some insulation in our home on a Sunday afternoon, and my daughter, who was young at the time, was helping me. We were pressing thin strips of adhesive-backed foam into the corners of windows and doors to keep out the drafts. At least that's what I was doing. She was doing something else. Will this really keep out the giraffes, she said. You can hear the 5-year-old mind at work. How did they get into our garden? Can this tiny strip of plastic really keep them out? Because everyone knows how tall and thin they are. They can probably squeeze through the tiniest cracks. And what will happen if they do? Will they tangle us up in gangly limbs at breakfast time? What kind of cereals do giraffes eat anyway? And will I meet them on my way to school? My daughter was a millennium baby. She has a certificate from the Queen to prove it. Her age will always track the passing years of the 21st century. How old will you be in 2050? She will be 50. It's her century, the one in which the climate and many other ecological battles will either be won or lost. Her class held up placards back in the noughties when the UK led the world on climate legislation. It's our planet. But where are we now? What will it look like in 2050? Will there still be giraffes on it? These are her questions and mine. I've thought a lot about those giraffes. At first, I mistook them for a childish interpretation of a weekend chore, but with Khalil Gibran's help and the memory of my daughter's moon face raised inquiringly, I see I was mistaken. The giraffes are there. They really are in the garden. The task is real. Keeping out the giraffes matters. There are lots of puzzles in our failure to combat climate change. One of them is the many easy things we routinely fail to do about it, like draft stripping, for example. Insulating our homes becomes unassailable. It makes absolute sense. In the midst of a cost of living crisis, it makes even more sense. It saves us money, lowers our carbon, reduces our exposure to Putin's aggression. It makes our lives safer and more comfortable. And yet they don't get done, these simple things, time and time again. The technologies work, the economics are favorable, the results are demonstrable, but our political attention is missing, or our priorities are elsewhere. Climate is the bottom of our list. Rainforests are a long, long way from here. Our lives, instead, are taken up with daily tasks, putting the kids on the bus, getting to work on time, surviving shop floor politics and email overload, foraging for groceries, throwing together meals, binging on Netflix, collapsing into bed, eat, sleep, repeat. We count ourselves lucky to make it from one end of the day to another, locked in routine, lost in anxiety, striving for status, keeping out the giraffes. For everyone knows and instinctively fears the havoc that long-necked creatures wreak when they slip through the cracks in our lives. That isn't all there is, of course. Our lives routinely rise above routine. Relationships matter, family matters, hope for the future matters. And we constantly strive to keep those hopes alive. The daily grind is lifted from obscurity by the color of our dreams. Our aspirations soar on rainbow wings. We continually crave a better life for ourselves and our children. Occasionally, we escape into moments of unadulterated pleasure, and from the loose fabric of fantasy and the radiant colors of desire, we create and maintain a sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. What is the objective of the consumer? Asked the anthropologist Mary Douglas in an essay on poverty written over 30 years ago. It is to help create the social world, she said, and find a credible place in it. This deeply humanizing vision of consumer lives is also a forgiving one. We would like to condemn materialism as greed and damn consumerism to hell. But in the same token, we are locked into its social logic by our own symbolic attachment to stuff. Matter matters to us, and not just in functional ways. Beyond the immediacy of material sustenance, food, clothing, shelter, consumer goods provide a kind of language through which we communicate. We tell each other stories through material things, and with those stories, we create the narratives that sustain our lives. This task, and I'm coming to the point now, is a fundamentally artistic one. Technology is important to its functionality. Science furnishes the understanding. Artifacts offer a language. Goods and services provide what Amartya Sen called our capabilities for flourishing. But the task itself is an act of creation, a creative gesture. It calls on our imagination, our hopes, our vision. It engages our values, our identity, our sense of shared humanity. Society hangs on the gossamer thread of collective dreams. It always has done. Living is an artistic endeavor. That's my point. Art doesn't portray life. Life doesn't imitate art. Life and art play endless swing ball in each other's backyard. The uniquely human adaptation of artistic expression is as strong a force in our shared history as were the steam engine, the semiconductor, and the internet. Infinitely more so. The stories we told, the visions we saw, the dreams we shared, these were the building blocks of civilization, the harbingers of progress, the bringers of hope. In making this claim, I'm not attempting to privilege artists. Art and celebrity are crudely intertwined in the modern mind, but celebrity isn't the essence of art, just its expression in a confused culture, adrift from its moorings in shared meaning. Nor am I trying to suggest that art can rise above our culpability for ecological change. That would be ridiculous. The hands of the artists are stained with the blood of empire. The lifestyle of a successful pop star can beggar the carbon footprint of a sub-Saharan nation. Art miscatalogued too many abuses and stood silent through too many atrocities. But it also suffered those atrocities. It bore witness to the cruelty that people inflict on one another. It gave voice to the oppressed, spoke up for the dispossessed. It understood our joy and commiserated in our sorrow, whispered to us in our own language. The heart has reasons. Reason does not know at all, said the French philosopher Pascal. Art speaks to and from the heart. In its purest form, the artistic endeavor is a form of creation, one that we're all engaged in. I think I probably came to this realization early on in my life. The written word for me was an escape from the voluble relatives whose conversation I could barely puncture with my half-formed hopes and dreams. Writing plays was a way to tame that volubility and make a kind of sense of it. Telling stories was a way of living life to the full, connecting with the experiences of others, journeying along the road less traveled. But almost as soon as I'd set out on it, I was called away from the task by a calamity that drew me out of my daydreams and into the immediacy of the world. The meltdown of reactor number 4 in Chernobyl in April 1986 was a wake-up call to the aspiring playwright hoping for fame. My parents had dragged me to CND rallies to protest against nuclear weapons, but the dangers of civil nuclear power brought home to me the leviathan power of runaway technology. The next day, I walked into the offices of Greenpeace in London and asked them to find me something to do. They set me working on the economics of renewable energy, and overnight, I became an accidental economist. And since that moment, I've looked up from that task barely long enough to write a few more radio plays and to insulate a few kitchen doors, of course. That journey took me not to London's West End, but briefly at least to Westminster's inner sanctum when I was appointed as Economics Commissioner on the government's Sustainable Development Commission, where I wrote a book that effectively put paid to my playwriting career. For now, I'm not going to say for good. But the last decade or so has been an extraordinary roller coaster through one of the most painful conundrums of our time, what I call the dilemma of growth, a kind of can't live with it, can't live without it struggle to imagine a different kind of economics informed by a different vision of progress. Prosperity without growth was not a work of art. I like to think it's reasonably well written, of course, but its intended audience was policymakers. In fact, in its original form, it was a report to the British Prime Minister at the time, the first ever such report to a standing premier that dared to question the shibboleth of growth. And I think my working assumption was that if I made it as accessible as possible and as logically coherent as I could, the force of its arguments would carry the day. The policy proposals would be adopted and things would change. Call me naive. In retrospect, I was. I got a glimpse of that when the day before the report was launched, I received a phone call telling me that number 10 had gone ballistic. This, it seems, was not the way to win friends and influence people. But in the intervening years, I've been surprised and humbled by the number of people Prosperity Without Growth did reach, way beyond the intended audience. And I've also had to watch in horror as its recommendations were ignored over and over again. I began to realize, or perhaps to remember, that logic does not always carry the day. The heart has reasons, reason does not know at all. And when I sat down in the early months of the pandemic in 2020 to write another book, I realized it had to be not so much a sequel as a prequel to the earlier one, a more philosophical piece, telling the human stories of those whose work had inspired my own work, and those whose vision might inspire all of us to imagine a better world. Economic wisdom wrapped up in poetry was one of my favorite reviews of the book at the time. Post-growth, life after capitalism, allowed me to connect with the playwright inside. It reminded me of the power of human story in the task of collective imagination. It's too early to say whether post-growth will be more successful than Prosperity Without Growth in changing the political agenda. But it's clear that any attempt to change our world must recognize a fundamental truth. It must speak a language people understand. Science can sketch the nature of the problem. Technology can facilitate the solutions. Economics can point out the costs and the benefits. Art engages the soul. It speaks to the moonstruck child in us. It whispers to the giraffes. Art looks like the perfect addition to our instruments of change. And yet I want to resist the call to think of art this way. Perhaps art can succeed where policy fails. Perhaps we can sketch and compose and sculpt our way towards a well-being economy. Perhaps celebrity artists can lead us by example towards sustainability. But this line of thinking falls into too many traps: that art has traction in politics, that poetry speaks truth to power, that art is instrumental at all. Some of these things may be partially true, but the biggest danger of all lies in subjugating artistic endeavor to reason, because doing so risks robbing art of meaning. And meaning is something I suspect we're going to badly need in the times to come. Instead, I want to propose that we keep art free to play a far more vital role in the emotional fabric of our lives. 3 roles, in fact: vision, resolution, consolation. Let me finish by speaking briefly about each of these. I'm fascinated by the proliferation of post-apocalyptic visions of the world, from Russell Hoban's Ridley Walker to David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas. from Saki Lloyd's Carbon Diaries to Will Self's Book of Dave, and perhaps most poignant of all, dark though it is, Cormac McCarthy's elegiac novel, The Road. Literature is replete with memories of the future. And the astonishing thing is that even for someone like me who's worked for over 3 decades in the science of the future, those stories have an extraordinary and unexpected power. They connect me to tomorrow in a way that scenario models somehow fail to do. Perhaps even more striking are the visions of our inner world. I think, for instance, of Rembrandt's allegories, Chopin's nocturnes, Rodin's sculpture. In Rembrandt's iconic Return of the Prodigal Son, the father's strangely feminine hands rest on the shoulders of the returning son, whose torn and tattered garments somehow radiate a golden light. In an amazing early pencil sketch of the roadside scene in the parable of the Good Samaritan, he offers an extraordinarily intimate portrait of the altruist within us all. Beneath the noise of human strife, Rembrandt reminds us, lies a fragile interior space worth knowing about, worth protecting. These visions are not always comfortable. They're not without conflict and suffering. And here is another of art's lessons. As an environmentalist, I'm struck by our professional tendency to try and flatten the conflict landscape, to want to rush immediately to the promised land. But as a playwright, I'm acutely aware of the rules of the game. The essence of drama is conflict. The arc of the story requires a protagonist, a call to arms, a quest, a series of trials, a reversal, transformation, and a journey home. Resolution through conflict. Art pays homage to the nature of the journey, its sense of struggle, the power and partiality of resolution, not as an instant, comfortable future, but as a goal hard-earned, easily lost, and almost always temporary. There are lessons here for the well-being economy, for all of us. When the moon rises, said Lorca, the bells hang silent and pathways appear impenetrable. The way ahead is gone. Our children turn to us and ask, where now? Which way do we go? What would it take for us to admit that we don't know the answer, that we're lost, that our best attempts to combat climate change have failed, that our economies are bankrupt, that our technologies are broken, that our politicians have let us down, that restraint lost its fight with desire, justice its struggle against iniquity, that our vision of progress was an illusion, a dream we once had, a story we told our children to stop them getting frightened by the moon. This is where we need the consolation of art, its understanding of sorrow, failure, and loss, its intimations of transcendence. Nobody eats oranges under the full moon, said Lorca, who would die a few years afterwards at the age of only 38 from an assassin's bullet. One must eat fruit that is green and cold. You're not alone in fear, he says, and in the same breath intimates the time for oranges will come again. Loss is only part of the arc of the story. Reversal is only temporary. Art teaches us to look beyond the glitter of triumph and the shadow of disaster, and to detect beneath them the intimations of immortality. Vision, resolution, consolation. These are the tools from which to build a different future. Our ability to live well, to flourish in less materialistic ways, is in its essence an artistic endeavor. Sustainability is the art of living well within the ecological limits of a finite planet. Art is more than an instrument in this project. It's the very nature of it. So let me just finish by thanking you again for inviting me today and by encouraging you to see your work in this project over the next years, not as an adjunct to the technical change or economic reform that we so badly need, but as the very heart of the transition to a well-being economy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tim. What a beautiful, provocative and generous contribution. I think you've more than understood the intention, and it's certainly, none of us imagined that we wanted to instrumentalize art. It really is about opening the imagination and seeing that as the heart of the project. So thank you so much. Let me just indicate now how we're going to proceed. We have invited a number of people to respond to Tim's contribution, and we are inviting Tim, of course, to stay with us and engage. After our first two respondents, we'll open up the conversation to all of our participants. So our first respondent is Joe Mangan. Joe is an award-winning director, curator, and advocate, combining the three attributes we'd love to see come into the community of practice, to be part of the community of practice. She's the director of the Performance Corporation, a multi-platform creative company making work in theatre, opera, and virtual reality. Jo, can I invite you to make your contribution?
Thanks so much, Peter, and thank you for a beautiful poetic beginning to this encounter, Tim. I'm going to be leaning more on my advocate crutch here than my poetic one. I'm married to a writer, so I leave all the beautiful language to him. So bear with me for the straightness of my response. Fantastic mix of attendees. Really wonderful to see people from the sector and people that I know and have worked with in the past, and also people I don't know at all, and wonderful that they're all coming together under this Wellbeing Alliance umbrella. It's also fantastic that the arts is included in this notion around well-being, because it's not always the case. It's certainly not always the case that the arts and artists are included around tables of any kind of importance. And I really love this notion of a community of practice for artists. And maybe as part of it, I might be able to finally live out both sides of my life objectives, which are making art and making art that matters and has an impact in the world, or just having an impact in the world. And I think I've kind of run away from the arts at various times in order to imagine another way of having an impact. In preparation for this conversation, and I'm actually talking about something not dissimilar tomorrow with the British Council, which is sustainability in the arts. They're kind of doing a little closed conversation about that before they bring it out a little bit further to the sector. I was reading about degrowth, because it was a concept actually that I had only the vaguest notion of until Davey and I were chatting a couple of weeks ago about this. And I was excited to read about it being around organizing economies around human well-being rather than capital accumulation. Tick VG, we're all up for that. And I'd also add in the well-being of other species to that as well. I did find it interesting that Jason Hickles didn't mention the arts in that list of energy projects, food production, healthcare, education, housing, transport, etc. Pretty much every single government department apart from the arts. And that really is what we've struggled with, I think, in terms of being at the table, being considered worthy of being part of any conversation. And that's why this feels so very different. It's also, I think, for those of you that may not know, our sector is fraught, overworked, and undervalued. So it's really, so much so that the department had to start a initiative called Minding Creative Minds, which is really about creating opportunities for people working in the arts to have a sounding board outside of the arts for all of those stresses that, are a result of a 16-hour day where you don't get paid enough to make a living, which is still, unfortunately, the notion of the starving artist in the garret is alive and well in most government departments and encouraged. So responding to the idea of narrative sustaining the myth of economic growth, I'm not sure that the actual narratives that artists propound really do that, but we have used the predominant narratives to further our own aims, frankly, undoubtedly for our sector, but with what I would consider a significant amount of positive growth possible within our sector. For positive output, we won't demur from it. In fact, we argued for a significant period of time during my time as chair of the National Campaign for the Arts here in Ireland, that the percentage of GDP, that awful acronym, but it's the only language that the politicians understood. Once we were able to identify that investment in the arts in Ireland was the lowest in the entirety of Europe, did we start to see some sort of cogs turning and some sort of, well, wait a minute, we instrumentalize this stuff for cultural tourism, for social well-being. There was so many ways that the government departments were interested in instrumentalizing what we do, but they didn't know how poorly they were investing in us. It's also worth noting, I think, that the arts has always relied on subventions from the Renaissance right through to today, and only the most commercial of work, arguably, and people hit me over the head for this outside of this group maybe, the most commercial of work is potentially the least artistic that's financially viable. So basically, I believe that art is always not capitalistic. Sorry, that true art is always non-capitalistic, if not strictly anti-capitalistic. So through the resources that we can manage to gather around us, we create and pay people, and that has to come from someplace. So unless we're in the West End doing what Tim was aiming for himself and making the big bucks, and frankly, I was speaking to someone who works in the National Theatre who was able to tell me that a writer was getting 50 grand a week for a play that is currently in the West End in royalties. But that's like, yeah. So there is a commercial output for some, but not a huge number of us. So we definitely used that argument for better investment in the arts, as I mentioned. And a big part of that was actually through a conversation with somebody who's here tonight, Anne Ryan, from Universal Basic Income, who started to inspire the notion of what that might be, and in conversations. So it ended up on our pre-budget submission from the NCFA, National Campaign for the Arts, into the government 6 or 7 years ago, and stayed until it happened to align with the Green Party, who happened to want a pilot project to be able to get behind. So now we have universal basic income for a very small proportion of artists, but it's going to be transformational for those 2,000 that have been, plucked to have a living for the next 3 years. So I just wanted to say also, we don't ever seek more than just enough. So in that kind of notion of economic growth, I think you'll find the best people to run budgets, the best people to eke every single value out of every single penny that is put in their paws are going to be people working in the arts. So we are never looking for more. We're always asking for more and always getting less than we need. So there's what we call an invisible subvention that comes from the individuals working in the sector, actually, where we don't have 4 people to work on X, so one person has to do 4 people's jobs. That's kind of continual. We're also very excellent and natural collaborators, because we have to be, especially those of us in the performing arts, and across art forms, and in terms of research and connecting with members of the public. I think the difficulty for us is the fact that artists are expected to change the world when we are constantly asked to work for free. Our value is something very, very intangible. And I do think there's a possibly positive corner that we're about to turn in, bizarrely, the rise of AI, because I think the actual physical experiences and meaningful encounters with real human beings, albeit actors potentially, will become more valued. And then in terms of just thinking about the relentless, so we are completely in a place where we, a lot of people working in our sector think about relentless economic expansion, and the arts and touring in particular has been structured to take advantage of that. All I can do as somebody who runs a theatre company and is attempting to make work and make connections with people is have less impactful travel overland. Obviously a challenge being on an island. Digital connection, looking at the deep challenge of what we can do there, but really leaning into the advantages that various technologies offer us, including for us, virtual reality. So we've been making live virtual reality work where our performers are staying in Ireland and our show, as it were, in headsets is touring to Vancouver. And we were in South by Southwest with this project last year. And we're also specifically looking at work that examines and highlights biodiversity loss. So we're doing a lot of work in that realm as well. I think the artist has a significant role in non-didactic dissemination. I think that's what we are really good at. And we are developing a model of presenting and learning to deal with issues of sustainability in a non-didactic way, because I think we, apart from me not having beautiful language and just being a straight talker, I think we have the power through our art to communicate in a more effective way. And that effective way really has to be authentic for us. So I could talk for lots more, but Davey's given me the heads up there to stop. But I think maybe just to wrap it up, I'll just mention that we need to think locally in our work, as what we've constantly been thinking about. It's all about being international. It's all about touring. It's all about getting that kind of attention on your work and on your message. But if we can really focus back in on the local, I think we'll be really, really impactful. And there's examples like Chuck Dowsa in Dingle who are really, really doing interesting things along that lines. And yeah, I'm going to stop because I'll get beaten over the head if I keep going. Thanks, Davey.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I think that there are echoes there of the conversations that we will pick up on tonight and over the course of the deep dive in Derry. Lots of interesting examples of responses and articulations of what we want to engage with. I'm going to invite David Bollier, who is one of the leading authors, activists and bloggers in the commons space. He spends a lot of his time exploring both commons and commoning as a new paradigm of economics, politics, and culture. He's the director of the Reinventing the Commons program at the Schumacher Center for a New Economics in Boston. David, you're very welcome. Looking forward to hearing your response to Tim. Thank you.
Well, first I want to thank Tim for a wonderful overview and such a poetic approach to the ideas. I'd like to riff off of some of the things he's provoked in me and how it resonates in my world of studying the commons as a practical but also social imaginary for challenging some of the capitalist pathologies we're encountering. I'm reminded of a phrase that Bruno Latour once used, that we're suffering right now from what he called an epistemological delirium, that the stories of progress and development and growth are just no longer credible, but there's a cultural void that has been left in its absence or lack of credibility. And so as the grand narrative falls apart, there's a huge hole in our consciousness and culture that we're trying to fill. And for that reason alone, I think artists and cultural organizations have an enormous role to play in helping us devise a new grand narrative and sets of creative expressions for situating ourselves in a culture. I think so. Progressive artists, I think, have always had this role, and they've always prefigured what's going to come, not through any sort of magical prophecy, but because they have the talent and courage to state what is, and to be transgressive of prevailing norms if that's necessary to express it. And I even think that's been pointed out a little bit, that I think they speak in a visceral precognitive way and to our body knowledge. I love how Stephen Harding, a professor at Schumacher College, has said that Gaia is speaking to us through our bodies and it's expressed through the collective unconscious. And I think that's what the artists are drawing upon in so often of what they're doing. But I'd like to sort of maybe twist this a little bit by saying that we're conditioned to seeing art as something apart, an artifact, a commercial object that's separate from everyday life. And I think that we maybe should, just as I think the common should be talked about commoning, the verb, so art should be talked about creativity, the verb, creative expression in living culture that everybody needs to contribute to, not just self-styled or professional artists. The way that I just flash on how indigenous cultures, much of their ways of being and ritual are artistic in a very profound everyday way. And I think that's sort of maybe a part of the challenge we have, is bringing that artistic creative expression to imagining a different non-capitalist, non-commercial world. I happen to think that the Commons provides a discourse for opening up that space because however much Shelley may have been correct in saying that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world, there's a few concrete practical difficulties in making that real, much as poets and artists may speak to the human soul and aspiration. And so I think that the Commons helps open up some fissures in the capitalist enterprise for building something serious and alternative. I take a lot of inspiration from Václav Havel, who, as a cultural dissident before he became president, was asked what his strategy was, and he believes that it's important to build a parallel polis in the face of a repressive, totalizing system. In other words, that is a way to help build the horizontal relationships, the prefigurative economy, and to be able to express truth and other wholesome values without having to have them immediately co-opted or compromised by the prevailing political system. So I think that artists, and working within the framework and gestalt and aesthetic of the Commons, the ethic of the Commons, can help build a parallel polis that can begin to negotiate with a little more power and conviction and depth than maybe many political movements and certainly party politics. I'm inspired by a lot of artistic projects out there that are already doing this, not just in terms of the art they're creating, but in terms of the pure governance in art making and cultural organization. In other words, bringing commoning to arts and culture. I'm thinking of, for example, the Documenta 15 exhibition in Kassel, Germany recently, where an Indonesian artist collective, rather than curating the exhibition in a standard form, making the exhibition a staging area for pre-capitalist markets and art, decided to do an Occupy style thing by having dozens of invited curators curate the exhibition and have a breadth of players, and to think seriously about how to develop their own mutualizing structures for selling and exhibiting their art, bypassing the gallery systems, for example. And I can think of places like, or groups like the Arts Collaboratory, which is a consortium of arts and culture groups in Europe and Asia, Africa and Europe, where they have collaborative handling of money to meet their needs as a network. And I think of the Furtherfield Arts Group in London, which is exploring how digital autonomous organization in digital spaces might be used to both advance their art, but find the economic and financial means to support themselves in a different way. So in other words, I think we need new types of institutional forms to fortify this work, new types of, for lack of a better term, relationalized finance. Locally here in Western Massachusetts, there's the equivalent of a CSA, community supported agricultural regime for jazz performances, which is a way to sort of bring users and artists together to support each other. So I think it's this kind of innovation, not just in the art making, speaking to the zeitgeist and our needs in confronting capitalism and in non-propagandistic ways, I might add, but also the kinds of artistic organizations and forms that can put art making and culture on a more stable footing and not be so subordinate and beholden to capitalist market structures. And this obviously is a longer, more complicated conversation, but I think it's one we need to engage with. And perhaps the state can have a role if it can play a non-directive role in supporting a lot of this, in providing enabling infrastructures that allow artists to self-organize themselves, manage themselves with the ethic of the commons. So I will leave it there, but I think that this is the critical need we have in trying to make an ontological shift or an epistemological shift from where we're at, from capitalist modernity, into something that's different. And I think artists, as has been already said, are really pointing the way. We just need to complexify and broaden how that is applied, how that's enacted going forward. So I will leave it at that, and I look forward to the questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, David. That was, again, setting the scene for a really fascinating conversation, which will inform our weekend as well. Tim, I wonder if you'd like to come in briefly and respond to some of the points that have been raised by our two keynote respondents.
Thank you. Thanks, Peter. Yeah. Joe, I'm astonished by and slightly alarmed by the career opportunity that I missed by not being paid whatever it was. I can't remember what that figure was. I think, although, you know, a little bit in response, I did receive £11.52 just recently for a play that was broadcast in 1994. So I'm not giving up the idea that at some point, you know, there'll be a revival of Tim Jackson's radio plays, and I'll be rich. But what I really appreciated about your contribution, and it sort of echoes also something that David said, is this idea of art and activism as being parallel tracks towards change. And I also recognize that conflict, that actually the energy of creative art is not always the energy of activism. And although it can, and art and theatre in particular has a long history of infusing the public discourse with a kind of anger about the situation and the wrongness of a situation, it isn't always easy to maintain those two tracks simultaneously, and the work of activism and the work of art, I think, can learn from each other, can support each other, can be part of each other, but they sometimes actually you're drawn apart, and the role obviously of the accountant and the theatre manager in making that possible is absolutely in itself another art. And it sort of, that to me reflected also on one of the points that David was making. I was very taken with that quote from Václav Havel, who of course was himself a playwright, and he created and partly created that parallel polis through the visions and the values that were embedded in his work as an artist. And so I think, again, it speaks to that sort of slight tension in the human being between the desire for a kind of purity of art and actually the desire for art to play its role in the change that we can desperately see needs to happen. And like David, I also agree that to some extent, that isn't simply about art as a professional occupation. It is about art as a participation in the act of creativity. And that's, to my mind, a responsibility and a right for everybody in society. And so creating the opportunity for that is not necessarily about big budget tickets that end up in the West End. It is about what happens in the community and what happens in people's everyday lives. And as an element in prosperity itself, I think that process of creativity, as I was saying in my introductory remarks, is not simply instrumental. It can never be simply instrumental. Art is, in fact, a part of the nature of prosperity because it calls on our creative being, and that creative being, without that creative being, actually we lead thinner, less meaningful, less fulfilling, less colorful lives, and creating the opportunity for people to fulfill themselves creatively in that way is a part of what prosperity and a part of what the well-being economy should be trying to do.
Thank you very much, Tim. So we've reached the point where we're going to take a very brief pause and invite you to indicate if you have some points or questions to raise. There's an opportunity now for the remainder of the session until we hear from Marina. So we'll take a brief pause and come back to you, hopefully with an opportunity to come in and raise some of your own responses. Thank you. Declan, take it away. Thank you, Declan. So let's move to some of the points. We'll take a few points and then invite Tim to come in. Dougal has raised a point that will be all too familiar to Tim, who has worked closely, of course, with the UK government and has lived with some of the responses to his work, as we've heard in his opening comments. Dougal, do you want to make a similar point, I think, from New Zealand? Dougal?
Yeah.
Do you want to come in there?
Yeah. Look, sorry, I was away from the desk just for a minute. yeah, I'm not sure that I was expecting to be asked to elaborate on that. I just simply wanted to say hi to Tim from down here, and we had a great discussion, and although we didn't really get onto a well-being economy, we tried to convey the shortcomings at a very basic level of our existing systems, and the response, frankly, was disappointing. So my comment was only that, yeah, that the challenge really seems to be how the hell do we connect with other people, and yeah, that seems to be the struggle, and I really hope arts can help. I mean, we need it all. So yeah, there's nothing more profound than that, really.
Thanks, Mr. Gold. Colin Sands, would you like to come into the conversation?
Thanks very much, Peter. Yes, I would indeed. Really enjoyed all the contributions so far. Just briefly, my own experience, I've been a songwriter, storyteller since the 1970s, and had a sense of the power that the arts could have. Playing, I think it was 1974 in East Berlin at a time when very few Western artists were coming across. And that is 1 year after another theatre director had been assassinated, Victor Jara, in Chile. It was a time when many musicians were traveling to that festival to try and give some sense of what was going on in their home places. So we met people there like Inti Illimani, who had to leave Chile to live in Paris, Mikis Theodorakis from Greece, Maria Makiba, Harry Belafonte, and so on. But Victor Jara was, as probably many of you know, was also a singer, and he was imprisoned in the football stadium there, and he kept singing and playing his guitar. They broke his fingers, his hands, and then they shot him eventually. But it would suggest that a poet, a writer, a theatre director can carry enormous power. I also was at that festival, the Documenta Festival in Castle. There's mentioned, find that very interesting indeed, the ways of bringing a message across. Very often we can argue, put forward legal arguments, which will always be important, of course. And there will be legal deflections in place from people very well experienced in that kind of thing. I feel though that those people who have well rehearsed deflections and denial systems of language, I suppose they can't always respond so well to satire, irony, humor even, that can be put across by musicians and writers. I think that can also be a very powerful tool. And just one final thing, because I saw the word well-being in this discussion, I thought that was a really interesting one, maybe looking more in a more specialized way, in the sense that many campaigners will be exposed these days to a form of gaslighting, in that many of the consultants who are working for government bodies and supplying information and so on their, to support various planning applications will be putting in their false documents and so on, misleading and false, as has been identified interestingly this year by the Northern Ireland Audit Office as a direct result of campaigners submitting their experiences to government departments. And I think it's called Fraud in Planning, a document which a government body has published this year. So I think the combination of art, legal arguments, and just alternative angles, as was mentioned earlier on as well, music, poetry, and so on, can reach a different part of us than our brain. And I think that's well worth using and working on. So thanks very much. It's great to be a part of this.
Thank you very much, Colin. John Barry, would you like to come in at this point?
Yes, hi, good evening, everybody. Hi, Tim, long time no see. I see many people I know and many I don't know on the call. It's wonderful. I really enjoyed this conversation, like many others. It reminded me of Plato the great Greek philosopher, who in his famous book, The Republic, a rather authoritarian vision of the future, which the Catholic Church used quite a lot to structure its organization. But in The Republic, Plato banishes the poets because they're unruly and they're transgressive. And I think that's a common theme that's coming out tonight. I suppose I'd like to, invite the three speakers now to reflect upon the tension between art and activism. On the one hand, we have the urgency of the crisis and the need for action. But at the same time, then I got a strong sense of people wanting to avoid being propagandists and so on. So I wonder if people could reflect on that tension on the one hand, that we need to do a lot of things very, very quickly at scale. And certainly art can help in that. But at the same time, avoid those accusations of being overly didactic. And then the other, it's more of a, I suppose, an observation, but it's something that as a long-time environmental and green activist and academic, much like Tim and others on the call, there's a terrible sense in which the green perspective is like the teetotaler at the party. There's this constant finger wagging. You can't fly, you can't eat red meat. It's all gone to hell in a handbasket. And I do think there's something in our conversation tonight, as Tim, beautifully opened up for us, of the need to introduce sensuality, pleasure, and joy into even the struggle to move beyond growth, carbon, and capitalism. So perhaps maybe just maybe observations on that tension between art and activism without veering into being didactic, but also maybe any reactions you have to that, the importance of integrating, particularly pleasure and joy, which is often bereft in often science-based or even sometimes moralistic aspects of green arguments. But thanks everybody so far for a really, really great conversation.
Thanks, John. And Greg, you'd like to come in at this point? Greg McChesney.
Hi, I just did that frantic scramble for my things whenever I realized my name was being called. Yeah, I feel like the point that I was making is that I think everybody here on this group is completely in agreement that art is vitally important, but how art is made, how art is disseminated, and how art is received is fundamentally changing. I mean, with the shortening of people's attention, and I know, Peter, that's something that you can attend to, is like it's drastically shortened, and people's kind of receptivity is being drastically reduced. How do artists contend with that? How do you deal with that? And how do you, in an ideal world, use that to your advantage?
Can I ask, Kevin, would you like to make your point? Just come in briefly. Kevin Murphy.
Well, I suppose I'm fascinated by these questions, actually, about how art is now mediated in a different way, which is true, I think. And then there's a sense of urgency that, of course, is difficult to deal with. And art is no different in the sense that it has to deal in the real world, which I think is a point that's been well made. But I think we're kind of talking about the public narrative now. So thinking about what John said about the teetotaler at the party, which it turns out is what I am now, as I don't drink. I think that there's a real power in that. It's the way in which the message is being talked about and who is giving the message and what the relationships are that are being developed as that's happened seems to be at the center of this. And that's storytelling. I mean, Tim did the storytelling thing incredibly well. And if you do art well, then the story resonates and connects. Even if it doesn't always connect positively, it definitely connects and makes people think. So I kind of think it's a bit old-fashioned, all of this, but in a sense, it's very, very important to think about how we give these messages and how we relate to people and how they might be receiving these things. we haven't talked about class, which I think does come into this, and rights. We've talked a little bit about, but I think the rights aspect of this is really important. And my original point was around meaning. We talk at the Playhouse a lot about making meaning together. Effectively, that's what the arts activity is. So I'm wondering what are the means of exchange, if you know what I mean, and then wellbeing economy. That's what's on my mind. That was the point I was making. It's not about the money for us, even though we have to get the money to make it all work, and we're in the dominant system. But it's about meaning. So what are the currencies for a wellbeing economy? What are the means of exchange and dialogue? And is meaning one of those that we could play more on?
Well, did you want to come in there? Thanks, Noel.
Hello, can you hear me now? Hello?
We can indeed, yes, yes.
Yes. Just on the back of what Kevin has said, as someone who would have worked along with Kevin and many others on the Derry, Londonderry, UK City of Culture, 10 years on, the whole focus was very much on telling a news story and the importance of arts in a context of authentic conversations, of purposeful inquiry and joyous celebration. And I suppose my background is in arts education, working across the Education Authority and across the library boards, but also in the area of the Forum for Local Government and the Arts, working across government departments, and again working with Sir Ken Robinson on this Unlocking Creativity agenda. And I know, again, just been inspired by our speakers and the conversation. I suppose we're talking to the our tribe in this context, and I'm particularly interested now as we find ourselves emerging from this deep sleep, if you like, of COVID and the implications on our mental health and well-being. I'm also involved in the Northern Ireland Mental Health Arts Festival Committee, and my concern is that we need the arts and creativity and self-expression now more than ever before, irrespective of what the art form is. And I completely concur with the conversation earlier about the building this culture of creativity. And that is not exclusively, artists, but we must invest and nurture and nourish our artists and support them in their growth and in what they can do and how they can do it. And my initial concern was, particularly during lockdown, what was happening to support artists in an infrastructure that was becoming undone, if you like. I do believe that, I suppose, this idea of encouraging a culture of creativity is something that we should be fostering. It's an intergenerational context as well. And again, the point that you made, Kevin, about age or stage or indeed class, or context or geographical location shouldn't matter. There is something that unites us and connects us, and that whole area of creativity and self-expression in safe places is really, really important and vital for our mental health and well-being, and also in the context of building sustainable infrastructures for the future.
Thank you very much, Noel. Sean, you'd like to come in at this point?
Hello, everyone. Sorry, I'm afraid I have a big frog in my throat, so I won't speak for very long. I suppose I just put up there about making everyone an explicit artist, or somehow shining a light on the artist in everyone. And maybe I put that challenge to artists on the one hand, but there's another part that I haven't really talked about tonight, and that's the nature of Irish society, Irish culture. To a certain extent, we are very proud of being non-conformists, and if you looked at the soccer game the other night, where we lost, but it was a big celebration because we lost well. And we've had so many occasions like that where we can, as maybe it's because of our historical background, that we see things in different ways. And we have all of our storytelling and myths and so on, and languages on the island to back that up. But it's drawing from the depths of all of that to make explicit that each one of us is a storyteller, each one of us is an artist. And I'd like to put that challenge to the artists here, if you don't mind me saying so. As an engineer, how do you do that?
Would you like to make that point? Would you like to come in at this point, Anne Ryan?
Yes, hello everyone, and thanks to the great speakers and the great contributions so far. Yeah, I suppose I was just really struck by the David's use of the word gestalt and the idea that there are so many different strands to creativity. And of course, Tim said it as well, life is an artistic endeavor. And, you know, fair play to Joe for working on the basic income for artists, but it really is a question of, I suppose, just everybody's creativity being unleashed and supported by, and I think the state does have a role to play there in setting up the kind of supportive structures that that David mentioned through things like basic income, but not just basic income, but basic services, public services for everybody, so that everyone has this basic level of security. Because I always think that we have to be able to survive or cope well in society. And if we're always at survival mode, just trying to get by, it's not going to close down everybody's creativity, but it doesn't unleash it for everyone. And if people are to be able to critique as well. So I think survive, critique, and creativity are three things that need to be always taken care of for everybody, and that life can be a work of art. Actually, somebody said to me the other day, art is a form of the verb to be, and I thought that was a really nice way to think about things, about composing one's own life, which was the name of a book by Mary Catherine Bateson as well, that we're all sort of composers and improvisers in our own lives and in the structures around us, and the kind of liberating structures then that we would have time to participate in. So that's really all I have to say. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I love the idea of life as a practice of improvisation. It's very close to an interest around Zen. Peter Hershock often makes that comparison with the Zen practice and improvisation. So what I'm going to do now, I want to go back to our speakers, the two respondents, and Tim for some closing remarks before we then get some feedback from Marina Gattas, our keynote listener. So Joe, could I ask you to come back in for some closing comments and responses? Thanks.
You can. I don't know how I feel, guys. I feel it's very interesting. I feel like it's become a polarized conversation. I wasn't expecting it. I mean, a lot of the questions I've made notes of. So, you know, things around it being urgent. I was very clear about wanting to say that it's important that things are non-didactic because they have to be real. People can't respond to provocations just because they think they should. You're not going to get real art from that. You're not going to get anything that actually impacts people emotionally. So, you know, instrumentalized art, top down, has never worked. It's never changed anyone's minds. It has to come from the social conscience that is being engendered in artists and the entire population because of the way the world is going. How do we contend with the shortened attention span? We adapt. We stop making 4.5 hour long plays. We stop making things that, you know, you can't get up and leave. We stop telling people to behave in a certain way when they're in the theatre. You know, we have to embrace, what would we call it? Things like relaxed performances. We have to just adapt to the world that we are existing in, unless we want our audiences to get older and older and more curmudgeonly. Then, you know, I don't want that. I'm not interested in making work for people who are on the way off to the next plane, whatever that is, if you believe in it. Making meaning together is the only thing that matters. Whoever said that, it's the only thing that matters, and together is really important. So that's why I'm a little wound up now, because I'm kind of like, getting the notion that it's artists or everybody is an artist. And I don't think that's the case. Yes, everybody is an artist. Yes, everybody has things they need and want to say and should have the power to express. But there are some people who devote their entire lives to that, in the way that some of you have devoted your entire lives to a particular academic focus or a particular passion. And you have to, I believe, make allowances for that in society, if you value it at all. And that's why I come back with, do we not value it? And especially in the context of what this conversation, was set up to be, you have to value people who devote their entire lives to this. It's different. It's just different. It's kind of like a vocation. The priests are dead, whatever, there's some of them knocking around. The religion is dead. If you want people to devote themselves entirely to things that matter, artists will do that, but it matters to them so deeply that we cannot be told how to think, how to behave, or how to respond. It has to come from us. And then what are the meanings of exchange in a well-being economy? And that's just, yeah, you guys are going to sort that all out tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. And I think there have been very helpful responses to that. Let's not repeat the binaries. We need to break those down a little bit. Now, I want to go to David for some closing responses. Thanks, David.
I would just second what Joe said, and what I think we all agree, that it's all about making meaning together. But for me, it's about having the structures and social organisms, you might say, for doing that. Currently, under so much capitalist cultural markets, it's not possible. It's so commodified, it's so consolidated and centralized, it's so celebrified that there isn't a democratization of creativity or the means to reach audiences and people who want it. So, I mean, I think that we have to create new venues for art and new financial organizational forms for them to work. Near me, there's some people, Double Edge Theater, who have a farm where they do their performances in the summer evenings on their farm. I think Athol Fugard, during apartheid South Africa, they did performances in his apartment. And I don't want to get too extreme about it, but I think that points to other ways of meeting contemporary audiences where they are, and giving them a vehicle for this to be expressed in ways that conventional culture markets don't allow it to happen. It simply doesn't have the affordances. So for me, that's, I think, an important part of taking the undeniable poetic, expressive urges that artists have and giving them the plumbing, the vehicles for that to reach or to create new communities and to reach audiences in better ways than happen right now.
Thank you very much, David. Tim, would you like to come in with some closing thoughts before we go to our keynote listener?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Peter. What a fascinating discussion, and it makes me sad that I am not going to be there for your deep dive over the next little while. I guess I just make three kind of points in closing in response to some of those questions and comments. The first, I think, is that I absolutely agree with that idea that meaning is a currency, and I think it partly builds on a sense that dignity is also a currency in a meaningful life, and that was a part of Václav Havel's message, his parallel polis in a sense, and that leads to the idea, of course, that joy is a currency as well. To say a little bit in response to John's challenge that maybe we're all party poopers. In fact, I don't think they're mutually exclusive, those things. I think they can go together. And sometimes actually, some of the most powerful critique of modern society and the most powerful visions for the future build not off puritanical vision, but off comedy and humor, and indeed from joy. And so I think that's a really really important point to make, and that those currencies actually offer something that is a real, live, intellectual and creative parallel to the value system that we're living in and suffering under late modern consumer capitalism. And I guess my second point is that when you think about justice as a currency, for example, then you tap into an emotion which is common between art and activism. I want to bring that out because I think, there's a lot of ways in which activism and art overlap, in which they're driven by the same kinds of human emotions. And in particular, of course, we think about one of those emotions. I had a friend who worked for Greenpeace back in the day, and one of the things he said to me was that campaigners run on anger at injustice, and that response to injustice in the world is also something that conventionally art has taken, not just as its muse, but as actually as its point, its direction, and its internal meaning. And so, Ibsen's Enemy of the People, Osborne's Look Back in Anger, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, Carol Churchill's Serious Money, essentially high art in the sense of that kind of art that Joe is very keen to protect, that professional, meaningful art that reaches a wide range of people, driven actually by a sense of social injustice and anger at that injustice. And of those plays, Carol Churchill in particular lampooned what the money markets had become under Thatcher's capitalism in the play Serious Money. And it was, in a sense, a massively countercultural moment, even though, perhaps because the biggest audience for those plays were all the people who were working in the city on the financial markets that were busy raping and pillaging the rest of society. And that ability of art to reach out from a basis of understanding and performance and anger, I think is something which should be protected. And it leaves me very much on Joe's side that that professional scope of art to become something that you dedicate your life to become really good at, is something that matters in society. It's not separate from the idea that everybody can be creative and that life itself is a creative endeavor. The two things are symbiotic with each other in a really critical way. And then the final thing, that comes to me out of that is this sense that what we're playing out at the moment is a kind of value conflict. And the values that inhabit consumer capitalism are basically selfish, hedonistic, self-interested ideas about a materialistic lifestyle, almost entirely at the individual level. And what art can do, partly through its function of reaching out to people, and partly through its message, the message with which it reaches out to people, it can give voice to those other values. And that is a task that's so profound at the societal level that we should never, ever underestimate it. Where is the other looking side of human nature? Where is its traditional side? Where is the side that cares about the planet? Where is the side that cares about its kids? Where's the side that cares about its neighbors? These are the themes of great art throughout the ages. And I think whether that's visual art or drama in the theatre, or written art or painting, the ability of the artist to reach to that level of value speaks to the currency, not just of the well-being economy, but of society as a whole.
Thank you so much to Tim, and that were really, really interesting reflections by loads of people, and including, of course, yourself, and also Joe and David. I'm going to bring in our final reflection now from Marina Gassis. And at the very beginning of this event, we mentioned the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Marina is actually based in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, and she's a political scientist, artist, and creative strategist. And she's worked for lots of organizations, including the Vance Center for International Justice and the Brazilian National Congress as a parliamentary advisor. So, Marina, we're delighted to have you here. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Caroline. And it's been such a wonderful discussion. I've been tasked with the monumental task of kind of summing up and feeding back to this group a bit of the discussion, especially with regards to what that implies to the design of this new community of practice. I will do my best, but it's such a huge task. I will definitely fail and leave a few things out. As I was listening at first to Tim's very inspiring talk, and then Joe's very pragmatic talk, my brain kind of froze and I started to think about this feeding back into the discussion in three main areas. So first of all, I think there was a question here of who's participating in this community of practice. The second is the objectives of the group, and the third, the practices of this group. So to start off with who participates, there were a lot of mentions to, anyone can be an artist and that everyone being able to connect to that creative side, but something very profound about the artist's ability to kind of transcend and connect the spiritual world with the material world. And that is something that comes with time and dedication to this craft. And that speaks, I think, to this role of art, and we've heard this here, not only as being an instrument to changing beliefs and values about the economy, but fundamentally about ourselves, and this ability of the experience of art to bridge a separation that was brought upon by capitalism and that has disconnected us to our own selves. It reminded me a lot, several moments listening to everyone, about this quote by Stella Adler, American actress, that said, "Life beats down and crushes the soul, and art reminds you that you have one." And I very much saw when listening to Tim's story about the giraffe and this kind of angst that I think we're all experiencing of being in a world that's so chaotic and where we know that we need to do something different, but being so caught up in the day-to-day, and art's potential to actually shift that status quo and reconnect us to ourselves. With regards to the second point on the objectives of the group, so I did mention a bit about the utility of art and how this group should be avoiding that instrumentalization of art. But there was a lot about the potential of this group to elevate the arts and elevate the artist and the arts as a sector that's been widely undermined. Also in essentially helping kind of break this glass ceiling that exists, and I think Tim Jackson's point on fame was also critical here. We tend to focus a lot on the artists who have a name and a portfolio and are in galleries and theaters, but what about all the other artists who are producing so much incredible work, and how they can come to the front as well in this process. And in terms of shifting the narratives, I've mentioned about this connection and the narratives about ourselves as well as the economy. And I really liked someone's point on the legal process, because there's a question here of are we being unrealistic thinking that because we're bringing an artistic and creative endeavor to this sort of persuasive public debate, speaking poetry to policymakers. And it was a really interesting reference, the legal arguments one, because in the end, courtrooms aren't really about truth, they're about a narrative war and what really makes sense. And it got me thinking too, how can this group deliberate and promote different ways of talking about and expressing a well-being economy in a way that's not necessarily trying to go through the means of creating new meaning and having and expressing these specific values, which kind of go head on to the rational side, but through the tangents, explore different alternatives in a way that's not as direct and confrontational. And then the third big group, and I think that's where there were the most amount of comments here, about the practices of the group. So I really liked David's point on the prefigurative politics and prefigurative behaviors, because there's a lot to be said into the design of this group and community of practice about how it can operate in a way that's challenging the commodification of art, that's challenging governance systems around meaning making. And to Joe's point and Tim's point too about artists being fundamentally people who are, they're nonconformists, they're resisting the status quo. And they are, by essence, creating something that is challenging our ways of thinking and also ways of doing. It is an act of resistance to just choose to follow a path where we know it's going to be so challenging, and so few people have the courage, I guess, to dedicate their lives to this. So I made a few notes too on things that Joe pointed, which speak to this sort of ways of operating that I think are really interesting too, about the localization of that work and about the ways that through this meaning making, we're also being wary of the carbon footprint. And I really like the example of the virtual plays. So really thinking about this collaboration in a way that's also building something that can prove by existing that there are new ways of doing art and that there are new ways of existing in this world that are completely different and an alternative. So these are my 3 points that I've tried to summarize. I've probably left a lot out, but I really think that there's a lot here in this discussion to orient this new stage and the in-depth immersion coming soon.
Thanks so much, Marina. That was a fantastic summary of a lot of the things that were mentioned and a lot of interesting new concepts brought into. And I loved some of your comments about from poetry and I'm conscious of time. I'm not going to keep everyone long. One last thing I wanted to mention is that there's a project which is watching what we're doing in the community of practice and interacting with what we're doing as a kind of creation of its own art. It's called the Digital Storytelling Project, and it's being led by Hannah Paley from the Carnegie Trust. So we'll be publicising what we're doing as we go along. So it's just, if you're interested, please watch this space. And I'm going to post the link to the hub and our newsletter in the chat again now. And again, huge thanks to everybody. It's been a really, really interesting session, and I've really appreciated all the comments. I think I'm going to have to go back and listen to it all again to take it all properly in. And I hope you all have a nice rest of the evening.